All right. Welcome to Design for Drupal. Thank you for joining this morning. My topic is how I learned to stop worrying and love composable. My name is Greatens. I'm Senior Vice President of Open Platforms at Greatens. I've been in the software industry for almost 30 years. I actually went to school down the road in Worcester. Nearly all that time I've been working with web technologies. My most recent job is here with Greatens, and been with them for almost 14 years and been working with Drupal for all that time. Now, that's a little bit about me. One thing I want to know is, does anybody here know what happened on this day in history 50-ish years ago? Good morning.
July 20.
We landed humans on the moon for the very first time. I'm somewhat of a space nerd. I spent June driving my daughter down to space camp in Alabama, and we talk a lot about her being an astronaut. She wants to be an astronaut, which is great. Apollo 11. This year's a picture of Buzz Aldrin. He, along with Neil Armstrong, set foot on the moon for the very first time. There's one thing that's fairly unique about this picture, is that I believe it's the only picture of both people in the picture, right? So this is Buzz Aldrin, as I mentioned. There's a little white blob on the gold gold-plated sun shield, and that is Neil Armstrong. He's in the reflection. Now, so why do I talk about space and the Apollo mission, right? Well, there's a lot of innovation that happened to get us on the moon, right? We have integrated circuits because of that, or at least it sped them along. We have Kane, we have Velcro, we have lots of cool things, lots of innovation. And when you think about what we do, there's innovation that happens all the time, right? We're constantly evolving what we do. The things I did 30 years ago in college, they apply, but they're not the same. And so, when you're getting involved in a technology or a movement or whatnot, it can kind of feel like this. This is an image, if there are movie buffs out there, that comes from the movie Dr. Strangelove, which inspired the title for this talk. So now, what are we going to talk about today? Well, first we're going to talk about what is composable, how it's used, what are the benefits. I'm going to talk about how Drupal can be a really important cornerstone piece to your composable architecture. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, if you don't want to use composable architecture, how does Drupal itself work in a composable-like way, and use some of the benefits that we have there. And finally, I'll run through a few anti-patterns we've seen so far as we've built out some composable architecture. So, what is composable? Lots of people are talking about it now. I get a lot of email newsletters daily and weekly, and it seems like every one of them has something about composable in it. We're early on in the movement, so there's not a lot of coherent definitions, or at least we haven't converged on one yet. So let me add my definition to the litany of definitions and say that, to me, composable is a modular approach that completely separates the back end from the front end, right? And we do that by using an orchestration layer in the middle. And we build modular components in that so that we can get the information, the data, the functionality from the back end systems to the front end applications and the channels, so they can build out those great experiences. Now, what's nice about a composable architecture is, when done right, we can swap pieces of it out and not affect the whole system. So I can add a new channel and it doesn't matter to the rest of the system. I can remove a commerce platform, it doesn't matter to the rest of the system. So it's a really interesting and valuable way to build a durable architecture. We can also start out with something very simple, right? And start out with a very simple architecture and then add on to it as we go, and expand and scale as we need to. So before we talk deeper about what composable is, let's talk about headless. Headless is really important to a composable architecture, and this is something we've been doing for a while now. In Drupal, I think we've been doing headless implementation for probably 10, 12 years at this point. When I think about what headless is, it seems somewhat simple, but the front end and the back end are completely separated, and we connect them together with an API. Now, the front end can be focused on the experience, and the back end, can supply what it needs to build out those experiences. We contrast this with like a coupled Drupal approach, right, where Drupal is taking care of all of this stuff. Right? It's all put together. It's essentially taking that, the request, rendering out the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, sending that back to the browser. Browser is rendering that to the end user. With headless, we're using probably the modern JavaScript framework. We're using APIs to call into Drupal. It's responding, returning that data, and rendering out that user experience. Now, headless has, I think a few different advantages over coupled Drupal if you go that route. One is its flexibility, right? So we're not constraining the front-end developers and how they're going to build out that application. We can do a lot of really cool things, the front-end technologies and such, but we really have great freedom to implement that experience. We can work independently between the front end and the back end, right? The API essentially works as a contract. The front end defines what it's going to send in. The back end defines what's going to come back, right? And as long as we agree on those two things, I give these inputs, I get these outputs. The front end and back end can work independently of each other and emerge in the middle. We're not tied to a release cycle, specifically around the back end. So if you think about Drupal, and specifically Drupal 7, if you build a coupled web application with Drupal 7, you necessarily, if you want to move on to 8, 9, or 10, have to rebuild the theme, you have to rebuild everything involved in it, right? So really like a re-platform, without a redesign. If you built your Drupal 7 site in a headless fashion, right, as long as your new Drupal 8, 9, 10 back end honored that contract, we could roll out. We wouldn't have to rebuild the front end if we didn't want to. So headless is a pretty neat approach. Obviously, provides some benefits, but I think composable can help us even more, right? So as I think about composable, I think about it as headless at scale. When we build a headless application, and we're making our calls into the back-end systems, someone has to transform the data into the usable format. Somebody has to apply the business logic, right? A lot of times that ends up in the front end. Some of it in the back end, some of it in the front end. And so what happens when we want to add the next channel, right? Maybe it's a different website for a different brand. Maybe it's a mobile application. It could be lots of different things. If we have that business logic built into the front end, we necessarily have to figure out how to either reuse that code or rebuild that code, right? And when we build a composable architecture, we're taking that, all that business logic, the data mappings, those things, we're putting it into an orchestration layer in the middle, right? So we're completely separating the front end, the channels, from the back end, all right? And so when we build that orchestration layer, we're building these things called PBCs that package business capabilities, which incorporate all of that information. So as we want to go on, right, as we want to build a new channel, we just reuse those PVCs, and I don't have to worry about reusing code from other front ends. A composable type architecture really gives organizations agility, right? So if you think about the latest hot web trend, if you want to get involved with it, say it's threads from Meta, you use Twitter, now you want to use threads, right? We can easily incorporate that in and have it flow through, right, really easily, and kind of move on. And if we decide we don't like it, we can pull it out just as quickly and easily. So what is a packaged business capability, right? Again, we talked a little bit about headless and the fact that the front ends really have that responsibility of pulling together the data from the various systems and reusing the systems and representing it to the user. In composable, we move that into the orchestration layer, into these PVCs. And with a PVC or these packaged business capabilities, they really represent business logic. They really represent what's unique about your organization. And so that layer in the middle is going to be built out specifically for you, right? There are tools that can help us build it out, but ultimately that logic is really unique to you, and that's really where the value is for the organization, right? And we can build out the PVCs however it makes sense to the business. The only thing we want to make sure we do is we build them out in a way that they can be reused across the channels that we might be using. So we have these package business capabilities, and they're a key part of the composable architecture. And we know now what a composable architecture is. Let's talk a little bit about some of the key principles to a composable architecture. So when I think about a composable architecture, I think about 4 key principles: front-end agnostic, back-end agnostic, vendor agnostic, and capability orchestration. Let's start with front-end agnostic, right? Omni-channel. So I can deliver experiences across many channels. It doesn't matter what they are. It can be web, as we talked about, mobile, it can be voice, it can be SMS, it can be whatever you want it to be, right? Like the idea here is we can build whatever we need by talking to our orchestration layer. This makes it efficient and effective to build out these new front-end channels as we want to. Because really what we're doing is we're leveraging what we've already built, right? Once we've built that PVC, when built right, it can be used across many different channels. Back-end agnostic is another key principle to the composable architecture. Omni-channel, if you will. One of the great things about building a composable architecture is we should be able to and can add or remove these capabilities as we want to, right? So a lot of the organizations we've worked with, have had like a legacy commerce platform, and they want to roll off of it, they want to roll into something newer. We can effectively, by using that orchestration layer, help them gradually migrate to the new platform as opposed to ripping the Band-Aid off and going right to it. We can also experiment with new platforms as well, right? So if I want to, I can add a new platform, I can plug it into the existing PVC structure and provide it. I like it, I can keep it, and if I don't like it, I can remove it, and it doesn't affect the rest of the system. This ability to add these platforms and remove the platforms necessarily means that the composable architecture is vendor agnostic, right? If everything that we need is in the middle and we basically commoditize the platforms in the back end, I'm no longer dependent on the vendors for the various products I've got. If I don't like what they're doing, if I don't like the features, I can move on to the next platform. Capability management is the last of the principles we'll talk about. This means essentially I can have duplicative services here, right? So some organizations don't grow organically. Sometimes they come together by acquisition or merger, things of that nature. And everybody brings their own tech stack. And as you're working in the beginning on that, it can be hard to sort through it. If you build out a composable architecture, right, we can plug those things into our composable architecture and we can sort through it. So one, part of the organization can use Drupal and Shopify for their web presence, and another part of the organization can use Drupal and say Fabric Commerce if you want to, because the front end doesn't care about what the back end is doing. It just cares about the data and the content that it needs, right? And if we build this quickly, swapping those things in and out, or even using the orchestration layer to pass the traffic between platforms, is an interesting concept, right? And this means we can also even use multiple commerce platforms as an example, but use different capabilities from them. So let's say I really like how Fabric does the shopping cart. I can use that technology and still use Magento as my commerce platform. So that line in the middle looks like it's doing a whole bunch of stuff, right? Because it is. Let's blow that out a little bit and look at this. Now this is a reference composable architecture. It's maybe an easier way to see what's all happening here. When I think about this stuff, or I start talking to folks about it, I think about it as a layer cake, right? At the top of that layer cake, those are all our channels, right? That's the front end. All the different apps that we've built out. At the bottom, those are all our platforms, right? That can be commerce, it can be CMS, it can be CDP, it can be analytics, can be whatever you need. Could be, custom, applications that we built in-house, right? And what we do is we start moving up the chain. We start by building an integration layer, and we start to data map those things, if you will, right? So if I have multiple CMSs, I'm not just going to take the output from Drupal and the output from Content Stack and send it up the line, right? Somehow I need to translate that into something that's common that can be used above throughout our system, and this helps us to decouple, right, the front end from the back end. We take that functionality that we've exposed in those platforms, and that's how we're going to build out our PPCs. We start to combine those things together. So as somebody shops, right, we might want to talk to our CDP to dump some information in there. We have some analytics that we probably talk about, right? We might have an order management system. Lots of different things happen, right, as we go through that path, right? And that's where we're going to control that logic. And above that, we build out, we'll call it's an API, but it's more of a business-related API, right? It's more, trying to get in the language of the business, so it makes sense to, to end users, not just to developers. And we can also build up UIs here, so we can make it easy for them to build up their own experiences, right? We can make it easy for them to see into the system, to see what's happening, right? If we're using logging, for example, we can build a UI here to make it easy for somebody to diagnose an experience across all the channels, to not just see what happened on web and then have to go someplace else to figure out what happened in SMS and another place for an email marketing system. We can build out a UI so we can track that all the way through. And again, at the top are our channels, and if we've done our job right in the middle, we've completely isolated them from the back end. So changes to the back end, changes to API calls, things of that nature shouldn't affect them. So back to our diagram, right? If we were to talk about what that pink line really is, it's really those three things in the middle. It's the business API, it's the PDCs, it's the feature functionality mapping and data mapping at the bottom. So that's a lot about composable architecture. So how does Drupal fit in, right? And one of the things that I love about Drupal is how open it is. The community's built a great CMS that has been exposing data through APIs and things for a long time. We've been decoupled and headless, or been capable of that since before it was cool. And so, you think about it, that in itself makes it fit into a composable architecture, right? That ability to get the data and use the functionality through APIs is great. But one of the things about composable we talked about is that it's also vendor agnostic. And I think, what that means to me is that, the end result is it's a meritocracy, right? The best CMS is going to shine and be used, the best commerce platforms, those types of things. And I think, that Drupal is one of the best CMSs out there. It's been around for a long time. I think for those reasons, it serves well as a cornerstone in composable architecture. So, if we think about what are some of the attributes of composable architecture, we can begin to understand why I think Drupal is such a great fit for it. One is this idea that a composable architecture is a best of breed. The North Star is a best of breed, right? Like if we start now with an organization, they have a whole bunch of stuff all over the place, right? We can throw it all out. and then start over, right? So we're going to start with what they've got. But ideally, as we do that, and as the system grows, and as time moves on, right, we're continuing to move towards this idea of having the best of breed in there. Commerce platforms and CMS platforms tend to be the cornerstones of composable architecture. A lot of people talk about composable commerce. It's, like I said, in the newsletters I get and emails and things, there's a lot about that. But kind of along with that is CMS, because none of the commerce platforms does a really good job with the CMS, right? So a lot of times when we're building up something like an experiential commerce, type website, like we need to bring a good CMS together with a good commerce platform. As we talked about this, you might have gotten a sense, but there's a significant investment that's needed to do this correctly and to provide value, right? That middle layer, that orchestration layer, is challenging to build when you're trying to completely decouple the front end from the back end, right? To make sure those changes don't affect you. So that's a key to this. And then, of course, because you're going to make an investment, you also want it to be long-lasting, right? And so you have to expect that this platform will have a long life in production. So how does Drupal kind of fit in with that stuff, right? Well, it's reliable and secure. So we know we put it in, it's going to keep ticking, it's going to keep doing its job, right? And so if I want to cornerstone to an architecture, that's pretty important. We have a dependable, predictable upgrade path now, right, in the timeline, where we didn't before. And so again, as we need a long-lasting system, we need to know that this system, that what we put into it is going to last a long time. It's versatile, customizable, so it can grow with us, right? So our needs might be simple for CMS now, but they might grow as we grow. It's an open solution, right? So it makes it easy to expose our data. And the Drupal community is proven to have a great track record of innovation. All these things make it easy to recommend that as a key part of a composable architecture. So we've talked a lot about composable and principles and what defines it, and we've also talked about how Drupal can grade in the composable architecture. But what happens if you're not ready for a composable architecture? What happens if you only have a couple of platforms that you need to orchestrate? Or you really only need a website, and there's not a whole lot going on, right? So what happens when essentially composable is overkill for what you want to do? Well, I think Drupal is great CMS, as I've mentioned, and I think a lot of the reason it is because it can be used in a composable like way. So how can Drupal be like a composable architecture? Well, it's modular, right? So we have core modules, we have contrib modules, we have the ability to write our own modules. These make it so that we can build those PVCs within Drupal, right? And expose what we need to expose to our front end or theme or whatnot, what we're doing there very easily. It's open, so we're built on APIs. We have JSON API, we have RESTful web services in core. We can also use things like feeds or the migrate modules to pull data in, right? So we can be the hub of what's going on in a digital ecosystem. It's component driven. I've built a number of Drupal websites, and I can't remember the last one of them that didn't have a component driven front end to it, right? There's a lot of different ways that we've done that over the years, but it's really built in as part of it, right? We have layout builder and core. There are companies that have low code, no code type things that we can use, right? Acme comes along and said student. So we can build easily a component driven experience. And it's connective, right? So there's a ton of pre-built modules, as we talked about, and being modular, but a lot of those are directed towards pulling in other platforms. So it's easy to bring Salesforce in. It's easy to bring Google Analytics in. There's a number of commerce platforms that we can do that with as well. All right, almost to the finish. Anti-patterns and patterns. So a few things that I've noticed as we've worked with clients on this, in a composable way, but I think they have some use for us in the Drupal community as well. So connect the front end directly with each platform. In a composable application, as we talked about, we really want to not do that, right? We really want that orchestration layer to be how the front end connects to the back end as much as possible. It's not always possible. There's, analytics can be, kind of an interesting piece there, but whenever possible, we want to do that. When we're building in Drupal, if we're doing it in a couple fashion, I would say make sure that the theme is designed and built in a way that you can just drop in a replaceable without code. That would tell me that there isn't business logic that's in that theme. Pattern number 2, apply business logic as needed where needed. Again, we want to keep that business logic in the middle, right? We want that in the orchestration layer. That's how we're going to achieve the scalability that we want and the agility that we want. In Drupal, it's simple. Keep it in custom modules. Don't let it stray from a few key custom modules. The last anti-pattern I have for you today: force the platforms you use to do what you want them to do. With composable architecture, we're taking this best-of-breed approach. So we want to use the right platforms. If we can, if we're saddled with a choice that's already been made, we still want to avoid hacking those platforms. We want to do any of that, what we would call hacking, in our orchestration layer to preserve that for future use and not have it tied to the platform. Same thing in Drupal. Don't hack core. Use the best-of-breed approach if you can. So with that, what did you learn? You learned composable is a modular way of building out a digital platform. Completely separates the front end from the back end using an orchestration layer. We build that orchestration layer using PBCs, or packaged business capabilities, that leverage the back end tools to provide the data and the content needed by the front end to build those experiences. The composable solution is front-end agnostic, back-end agnostic, vendor agnostic, and it has capability orchestration. We learned how Drupal fits in and is a great choice, the cornerstone of the composable architecture. And we've also learned that Drupal is like a composable solution because it's modular, open, component-driven. With that, I say thank you. Ask if there are any questions.
Sure. So you call it PVC layer, is that right?
PVC, yeah.
In a couple of the examples at the end, I apologize if I missed this earlier. But it looked as though you were saying, like, there are conceptual ways of applying that in Drupal, like with the Drupal pattern. But is that necessarily, like, do you apply this layer more conceptually, or do you actually build something like GraphQL APIs, that kind of thing for that layer?
Yeah, I think it depends, right? I think a lot of it can be conceptual, right? Like a lot of, even composable architecture, a lot of it is about, separation, right? And making sure that we're focused on the right things in the right places. But yeah, you can certainly build out, PVC type components and expose them through GraphQL. When I think about like those PVCs, they tend to be things that combine like multiple platforms together, right? And so if you think about, I'm going to abstract it to composable architecture when we talk about Drupal, right? But a lot of times we're taking commerce and CMS together, right? So if I'm building maybe a products detail page, there's probably content I want from the CMS. I also want content, obviously, from the commerce platform, or maybe the PIM, right? Depending on how I build up architecture. And so we would expose an API, right, that would call into the PDC, and that would go to the various systems to gather what's needed, right? Now, if I think about this in Drupal, whether it's GraphQL or REST or what we're using for the API, we could do the same thing, especially if we're pulling together multiple systems, right? Now, before, people have been doing this commerce, CMS stuff together for a long time, and before it was like the JavaScript frameworks really took over, and we have a lot of nice capabilities. Like I would use, I have used Varnish, the custom ECL, to like pull in information from another system, right? So the end user just gets what they need, right? But I grab from the commerce platform what I need, grab from Drupal what I need, and render it. Like, so there's a lot of different ways, but ultimately, in Drupal, I would probably, if I wanted to leverage this pattern, it's about building a module that exposes some kind of API that pulls that data together from the systems, right? Or kind of works the other way, like you can call in, right? Like you're making a payment for your, I don't know, like you can also do this when the front end is providing Drupal as well, and we need to get that to the system. Thank you. Good. Sure.
I think in the past when I've worked with kind of these client service decoupled architectures, usually business logic is kind of consolidated or isolated as close to the data model as possible. That's what I traditionally kind of understood to be like business logic.
Sure.
But you put an interesting idea for it here where that kind of lives in this middle tier. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about what that is or give an example.
Yeah, I mean, so the idea, right, is especially knowing that when we're building on the composable architecture, that we're trying to use multiple platforms, right? The assumption is that you're going to have multiple commerce platforms or multiple CMSs, and so there's an integration layer that's got to happen, right? Like something needs to know how I connect with Drupal. Like when I want to make this call, this is what I have to do, and then this is the what I expect back from it, right? And then what we do on top of that, though, is we want to build a way to, to map the data to something that we've already built out, right? Like we have a model for content, we have a model for a product, we have a model for a customer, whatever it is, right? And so there's a layer that pulls that together, and that's where we're talking about being in the PPC land. And then that also allows us to really do the orchestration throughout the system, right? So when we do this, and especially as your platform, your digital ecosystem grows, and you've got a CDP, and you've got you've got a PIM, and you've got an order management system, and inventory management, and you've got all these different things. Like when I come in and I add something to the cart, right, or do those things, I need to talk to a bunch of different systems, and we just want to extract that out from here. All we want up top, right, is that the channel just knows I make this call, right? And the other part of the orchestration layer, especially when you're working with we work with some large organizations that have different requirements in different areas. Like I need to know if you're coming from Canada, that it's not going to go to to Shopify. It's going to go to Magento or whatever it is, right? So there's an orchestration that happens in the middle, and what we want to do, we want to be able to do is, like as we talked about adding like a new platform, we want to be able to like send a little traffic to that. Not all the traffic, we just say, hey, we're going to test this thing out, and does it work, right? And if it does work, okay, great, we can continue to migrate. The last piece that sits above, and we didn't talk about it yet, but one of the concepts I've actually brought to our composable practice is the idea of view modes from Drupal, right? Like we're not using Drupal view modes, but this idea that if I'm on a website, right, and I make a request for a product, what I want to get back is necessarily different than maybe if I'm in a mobile app or if I'm running an SMS campaign, right? Like I'm not going to dump all of that data back at you, right? And so that middle layer does a lot of heavy lifting.
So is the middle layer kind of fun? Is the middle layer, is that actually like a Drupal installation, or is that some other tech stack that lives outside of it?
It can be whatever you want it to be, but it's typically a different type of tech stack. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a different architecture, like a .NET or a Python application, or something else.
It's something else, right? It could be PHP if you want. It could be a lot of different, ways to do it. But yeah, and it's whatever you feel comfortable. Some companies are Java shops, some are .NET shops. There's a lot of different ways, so you can build it out in many, many different ways, right? But yeah, that is not built essentially on a platform. We're taking these platforms and we're pushing them down in the stack.
I think one more point about that is I think like on the client side, there's you have to determine, kind of make a judgment on how fine-grained those calls are from the client. Like, are you requesting an entire page worth of data?
Yep.
Or are you requesting something for the shopping cart, something for the user, or something for the product amounts?
Yeah.
Is that just a judgment call, or is that kind of part of the abstraction?
I would say it's a judgment call, but it gets built into that orchestration layer, right? So yeah, it depends because you can be too fine and have too many calls, right? And then it takes too long to deliver our payload. Or you could say, I want to get everything at once, but that might kind of sprawl the types of calls you've got too. So like there's a little bit of judgment to balance performance and things like that with ease of use for the developer or whatnot.
Thanks.
Yeah, go on.
Sure. I appreciated that you brought up the level of investment it takes to start building that middle layer, and that that's supposed to exist in a relatively long time in production because of that early level of investment. And one of the things you said earlier in the talk, the benefits of this architecture is the flexibility of being both vendor or platform and front-end agnostic. But it also seems like there's a pretty heavy lift when you change platforms and hooking back into that custom middle layer.
Yeah.
It doesn't just mean that, we're going to start using a Drupal site and Drupal knows how to talk to your custom code. There's a level of development on all of those platforms as well.
Exactly.
That seems like a really heavy lift to have that level of investment early on, and then anytime you want to add that new flexibility, you still need significant development.
There is and there's not, right? As you do more of this, right? We've at Bounties we've already built patterns to integrate with multiple systems. So, if you're on your own, then sure, everything is a new thing. If and this isn't to plug to work for an agency, but we're already doing that. There's also a lot of tools that are out there that kind of try to do some of this stuff as well, right? So that do those integrations and things for you, and then you do some data mapping as well in them. So the space is really growing, and there's lots of different ways to do it. But yeah, we kind of gloss over the fact that yes, there is investment into the integrations. What's interesting though is once you've done it one time, the pattern's kind of there, and it's not as heavy a lift. So once I've figured out how I'm going to talk to a CMS, the next CMS, yes, there's a lift because I have to know how to talk to it, but it's not as bad. But right, it is, which is why you want things to be long living if you can, right? So you don't want to, in my mind, you don't want to pick the fly by night, the latest and greatest, CMS, if you will, or commerce platform or whatever it is. You want to use something that's tried and true if you can. And a lot of the companies that or organizations we worked with, this is how do I get rid of this old ancient piece of technology? And one of the first things we talk about is building this in front of it. The first thing you do is just put something in between it, because now I can start to right. And the ones I've been working with a colleague, about on a lot of these concepts. And one of the things I didn't have in the slide today, because I don't have a nice slide for it, but it's essentially when you think about composable architecture, it's not like on-off, right? It's not like I'm not, now I am, right? It's, it's an evolution, right? And so, like you're going to grow over time and you're going to get there eventually. And that's what you'll do with a lot of this stuff, right? Because the risk in like re-platforming is like what happens if it goes wrong, right? But what if you can build it in such a way that the re-platform can happen gradually? Like I divert some of the traffic to the new stuff, right? Or if I'm trying to roll off of like a WordPress for my blog sites, right? Well, the legacy content can stay there, but now in my orchestration layer, I can say now the new stuff's got to come from here.
That explanation also addresses something else I was a little skeptical about when you were talking about like the best in breed and the meritocracy, that the best systems are what's going to float to the top. I was a little hesitant because that's not always the case. Sometimes it's like the systems the clients are using are the top, period.
Yep.
No floating. But by putting something in place in the middle, you can direct them to move away from those and allow that meritocracy to actually take place.
Yep.
Where, yes, you're using the system that they currently have, which is what you need to cater to because it's what they're using, but eventually you can move them towards the best of breed, which is pretty awesome.
And what they're using now might be best of breed for them now.
Exactly.
And in 3 years it might not.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's kind of the idea here. Right.
Cool.
Exactly.
Thanks, man.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering, like, if you had any North Stars, as you called them, for this particular layer, and also if in this layer, some one of those tools that you would use to build a layer deal with actual like orchestration or synchronization between the different backends, or if they have something like message queues or whatever. Just things to help ensure consistency between your backends.
Yeah. I mean, the North Star, right, is ultimately what it's really organization dependent. It's really dependent on what you're trying to do, right? And so there isn't one per se. But like for my money, I would rather be on one commerce platform, on one CMS, on one, yada, 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 if we can.
I mean, for the middle layer.
Right, well, so, do we have any patterns? I mean, we've been building a patterns. We've built out with a few different clients already, and again, it's kind of client dependent, right, which is what makes it valuable. But, the big thing for us so far has been to recognize patterns of like with the kind of data that we're mapping, right? So we have content, we have product, we have product categories, we have several different things like that we've kind of landed on, like what's generally usable across the different situations we've run into. The how you build that middle layer is the consulting resource depends, but it really does. So it really depends on, what your development team's talents are, where they're comfortable, and then how you want to build more pages. Like some of the tools that we've seen, they have the ability to drag and drop and build pages, right? That necessarily, I think, means you need to know a little bit more about what's going on, right? So again, it kind of depends on where you're going with it and how much, clients love like IT to be separate from marketing. And then when you get into that, if you really want to build that layer out, and you really want to build those UIs, that's also pretty important, right? And so the North Star may differ depending on, the organization's appetite. Not a great answer, I realize, but right now it's also pretty early on, so I think a lot of us are trying to figure out like what the best answers are. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you.